All right. Thanks everybody for joining today. And I want to welcome Alex Patterson to the podcast. Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. I think it's great to get a little background. So you're a developer relations engineer at FusionAuth, and I'd love to just start by having you tell us a bit about FusionAuth. I'm going to get that right today, and the work that you're doing there.
Yeah, no problem. So developer relations is always kind of this fun term, or developer advocate as well. It's kind of equal in many stances, but different in others. And I think every company you go to, you'll find you're doing different type of work. So first of all, the FusionAuth part. FusionAuth is a customer authentication and authorization platform. So if you've ever used like Firebase login, Clerk login, Auth0, those are very similar products. The one big differentiator that I always tell people is that we have our own instance that runs. So you're not shared up in the cloud with all these other customers or clients. You have dedicated infrastructure to yourself. So that's probably the biggest differentiator there. And as far as like being a DevRel within FusionAuth, it's pretty exciting. Typically, like I'm jumping anywhere from documentation to example applications to doing podcasts, doing meetup stand-ups. So it's kind of a whirlwind typically.
Yeah. And I noticed you have the term engineer in your title. Any reason that you selected that, or did they bestow that upon you when you joined?
Yeah. So it's interesting as I've kind of gotten older or like further in my career, I don't care as much on titles, and I think other people do. Like that's totally fine. But that was bestowed on me, and I think actually the more I've like come to appreciate the engineer title back in there, because I've had it in the past, and we do a lot of development work, right? Like we're doing, pull requests probably every day, to be honest. And we're working on programs still. So truly at the core of it, we are engineers at the end of the day. We are creating applications. And to put developer relations kind of in the right context there, I think it's very nice to have that back in my title. I don't get too hung up on it though. So that's the part where I'm further along in my career enough to say, here's all of my experience that I've had in the past. So just take a look at that. Not necessarily like, was I a CEO and a founder and a this? Like they all kind of mean the same at the end of the day, whether you're a developer advocate or a developer relations engineer. It's kind of one and the same in my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, I've definitely had a lot of titles along the way, and I I started as an evangelist, which as we've seen has fallen out of favor, and
Yeah.
now we've seen a lot of I would say the rise of the developer experience teams within companies that have developer tools and public facing APIs and things like that. So just an evolution of a title, but probably is less important than the work that we're asked to do within these companies. So I'm curious with you, your journey that brought you to FusionAuth and developer relations, developer advocacy. What was that like for you?
Yeah, maybe I'll give you kind of a snippet from like college all the way through. It might help with it a little more.
Sure.
So I graduated from a little university in Michigan on the west side, Grand Valley State University. Go Lakers! And after that, it was kind of like I need to find something in this space as I get my master's program. And so West Michigan is known for office furniture manufacturing. The big three in that space worldwide are on this side of the state, and so I was able to jump into Steelcase at first, which is the largest office furniture manufacturer in the world. Many people out listening to this are probably sitting in a chair from them, if you're in the office, some at home.
Yeah.
So anyways, I jumped into SAP, which was a totally different thing from what I was going through. Like, so in college, I learned Java, and so it was very object oriented. We had assembly classes and stuff like that. But the interesting part for me jumping into that was just the overwhelming business side that came along with that. And I started to learn like, okay, I definitely like being on the side with people, not just technology. So I had to, of course, learn ABAP, which is the language in SAP, which was fun, but I found it more interesting to interact with the application developers on that side of the house too. So ended up kind of doing that for almost a decade between Steelcase, Herman Miller, Hayworth, all over the place. But I was able to also kind of get some experience using like .NET technologies to do RFCs and post those out to websites. And in my heart of heart, I'm always a web developer, so that's what I'd always come back to. And we'd create dashboards on the web and things like that, which led me to like Angular 2 and past jQuery and into framework land, so into what is now known as Angular. And eventually I decided like I really need to get more experience on the technology space outside of office furniture manufacturing. So that lent me into more of a consulting role at that point. And I did some, I was in cloud architecture at one point, and then just kind of all over the place, honestly, but still surrounded on the web side of things. So got to do a lot of cool projects there. But part of my goal has always been I wanted to teach technology and kind of give back to where I got my start too. And so in that whole course of things going on, I was able to teach for the first time at my alma mater, Grand Valley. So I went and taught an ABAP class, SAP class as a whole. And my experience wasn't as exciting as I was hoping it would be. Maybe I'll get there again one day when I slow down a little more, but I found people are just in it for the grade and not the actual like learning and experience side of it. And so that's kind of why I started CodingCat and wanted to teach kind of web tutorials online, and started to go down that road. And at that same time, I was like, well, what's this developer advocate thing, and what's that like developer experience? What's going on in this space? And honestly, it's such a relatively new area that it fit quite well with everything I wanted to do. I wanted to teach people how to use technology. I wanted to be in a technology web space, and there's so many opportunities in that space now. It's been pretty exciting. I've kind of bounced around a little bit to finally ultimately stumble into FusionAuth.
Yeah. So CoderCat, give us a little rundown. What was that? Because it sounds like that was the bridge that brought you into developer relations.
Yeah, so I guess in many ways that is probably my like open resume, if you will. So CodingCat.dev became the catalyst for many of these things. So that's where I started teaching like Firebase courses, which are a little out of date, I'll admit, freely out there. So there's a couple different courses out there for JavaScript and HTML, and I want to like continue to build those up. But it's challenging, right, to have kind of this side project always going on. And a big part, like what you're doing, is my podcast. And that probably takes up the majority of my time, honestly. So we record at least once a week, and I also do a live coding session whenever we can too. And the biggest challenge on that front is kind of that founder mentality, if you will. And so it's like learning how to run a business, learning how to do taxes for a business. How do I get sponsors pulled in? Like there's all those aspects that take up so much time, but that all helped me in kind of the developer relations space, right? So when I applied for my first job, they're like, tell me about CodingCat.dev. Like, what are you doing there? And like everything I did there is what applied to my first job as a developer relations engineer.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's super fun.
I had a similar experience.
It's really cool.
I find that if you're following your passion in your free time, and then that sort of coincides with the work that companies are looking to hire for, then that can be a really powerful combination. So happy you found that.
I mean, we've probably been told many times over the years, if you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life, right? I don't know if that's fully true, but it definitely helps.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that kind of leads me maybe into this next question, because it sounds like something you enjoy doing, which is developer experience encompasses everything that a company does that impacts our developer community. And you told me before the call that you were going on this one-man roadshow in 2024. So I guess I'm wondering, like, What's the objective behind that? What are you hoping to achieve by getting out on the road, and what's that going to look like for you?
Yeah, maybe a one-man roadshow is a terrible way to put it, but it is a lot of me trying to like travel to different places. And the only reason I say it's probably not a great way because I like earlier this week, working with our marketing crew to like update all of our slides because it's like they're very engineer based and it takes a whole community that works within get the point across, but they don't look great. And so I reach out to like our brand and design and say, hey, I know we're kind of going through some rebranding. Can you help me out with these slides and make them look better? And they're like, well, sure, let's see what we can do. And of course, like the first 10 slides they bring back look amazing. And I'm like, okay, so it's not just me. Like there's so much work that the entire team does too, especially with our docs and things like that. But the roadshow piece of it is trying to get out there and really address or get across authentication as a whole and kind of where things are headed this year. I think you're going to see like a rise of passkeys kind of coming up and like people not understanding what those are. Even I just had an issue with my mom, like in her 1Password and like, what is this thing? And like having to try to explain that. And it's really shocking to me when I take that into a developer community too, and take it one step further where it's not just the manual piece, like the actual logging in, but the technology behind that that's occurring too. And that's what I want to bring to different spaces when I do these roadshows. So for instance, I just did a local meetup where we did JWTs. So let's talk about what a JWT is and break it down. JSON Web Tokens for folks who don't know.
Yeah.
And like what is that made up of? Why do we care about a signature? Like how are the ways you're using it? Maybe you're using it wrong and you're not double checking certain things in your APIs. And so really kind of carving that out and going on that roadshow is part of it, which involves writing CFPs or answering CFPs, however you want to look at that. So call for papers come out for these different organizations when they're looking for speakers to come in, and so that's a big part of it too, where I often need help once again. So it's like I can talk about the topic, but let's make a great pitch, right? So now I need to bring in other folks within FusionAuth to say, what does this sound like to you? Can we sell this to a PHP community versus a front end React community, like something like that? And so it's always kind of that challenge to kind of bring that ecosystem together, but then like make it into, like you said, a road show that I can kind of take and continue to all of these different organizations as I go through as well. Part of that is some personal stuff too. So I want to try to go out and meet with developers that I've met online over the years, but like COVID hit and we haven't been able to actually sync up. So I just ran out to Portland and met up with Jason Langsdorf, and we got to like have dinner and chat and like learn some things about each other. I was able to go to a meetup with them as well out there. And then I'm hoping to make it just a little further south and go meet James Q. Quick for the first time in person. And that's another person that I've, been online with for years now. And it's just kind of cool to take those and try to find these different talks and go talk with individuals and meet them on the road too.
Yeah, I'm definitely in the. I'm not. I wouldn't say I'm doing a one man roadshow. Is probably not as many locations as you, but I am lucky. I'll be in Austin for the API Summit in March, and
Nice.
then I'll be doing a lightning talk at the Postman conference in May in San Francisco, which is close to home, so I won't have to get on a plane for that. But getting out and getting that face time and connecting with people in the community is, I think, a really fun part of the job, but also always educational because you're having an opportunity to exchange ideas, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Have you
I
have you
would.
shaken all the nerves off yet, Sid? Where like, do you still get anxious every time you do a talk?
Oh God, yeah, I think I
Yeah.
do. I try not to let it show. For other people listening who have to get on stage, uh, I was told once by someone who was training on doing public presentations that uh, be like a duck. You're smooth on the surface, but underneath your legs are paddling as fast as they can. And so, just remember, people see you as very calm, even though on the inside you might be having some butterflies. And if you just kind of accept that everybody's there and supportive, then you can get through the talk pretty easily, I think. But yeah.
So as long as they can't see the beads of sweat flowing off my face, we'll be okay.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my gosh. um I'm always fascinated about technology, and I'm not an expert in the authentication space. So you mentioned a term, passkey, and I think, just for our listeners, maybe you could, who aren't familiar with that term, maybe you could give a little explanation as well.
Yeah, and so Passkey is probably going to be the term that you hear the most, but it also ties a lot into like the biometric side of this and WebAuthN. So if you hear WebAuthN, you can think Passkey a little bit too. There's a little more to that we could unpack, but essentially in the future, what you're going to need to be able to do, and I love 1Password's example of this. So they will biometrically tie the device as well as like your fingerprint logging into 1Password. That will be associated correctly into the authentication flow. So instead of going in and typing in Alex Patterson at FusionAuth.io and then putting my password in, and that becomes the flow, it'll say, would you like to use your passkey? And often right now, there's still kind of a setup to that. So like the first time you do it, you might need that email and password, but then it'll say, do you want to use passkey? And you'll set that up. So at that point, once you say, yes, I'd like to set up a passkey up, it'll actually flow you through and say, okay, like put your thumbprint on your laptop. Let's make sure that's associated to this device. And now you're like locked in and good to go. One of the cool parts about like 1Password, and there's others, there's some more open source tools out there that you can use. But I'm trying to remember the YubiKey. So YubiKey is another example of being able to plug that into your computer and use that too. But 1Password's great in the sense that they will take that and actually store it across device too. So I can go from like GitHub's a great example, and Google's just now kind of rolling this out too, where you can go to GitHub. It'll say, do you want to use your passkey on my laptop? Yes, I do. I've got 1Password. We're good. I can do the same thing on my phone because it'll carry through for the passkey as well.
Okay.
So
That's
it's kind of getting out of the whole like passwords issue that we've been dealing with for years and years.
Yeah. I'm definitely seeing apps on my phone allow me to opt into Face ID. So is this sort of technology baked into browsers? Is this something that anyone building a native app on iOS or Android are having to do some extra work, or are the OSs or the SDKs that they provide, are they making it easy for developers, or is this something you guys are helping developers with? I'm kind of wondering what the ecosystem looks like.
Yeah, so WebAuthN is it's a specification that's done by W3C and Fido, and so that's kind of an agreement that you can put this in all of browsers, but it also there's a way to like cryptographically sign with those keys on mobile devices as well and do the storage. I'm most familiar with the browser side because of course I'm web everything, honestly. So with that said, kind of our goal is like, first of all, FusionAuth totally handles this, but I think there's a lot of confusion on the implementation side to it. And some of the difficulty is when you're using different products, like, I don't know if Clerk's a great example still, but I guess what I'm saying is when you use forms on your web page, right? So you have to do all of the authentication. You're actually like passing that typically through an API or some flow like that. The great part about having something like FusionAuth is when you actually hit our endpoint, you're coming to the FusionAuth instance, and we have all of this tooling baked into it already. So if you want to set up passkey, we already have all of that done for you. And that's kind of the biggest leap that I see when you go to the hosted solutions or even the SaaS solutions when they're out there, when they have all of the tooling and you know that it's a secure product, and now you can like alleviate yourself from the burden of like storing users incorrectly, having passwords where you shouldn't be, having these tokens that are coming from your WebAuthN which shouldn't be as much of an issue, but any sort of secure storage issues that you run into, having a product like FusionAuth take care of that for you, I feel like is night and day difference where things were 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
Yeah. What would you say before a product like FusionAuth provided all of this? What would developers have to do to implement this on their own? Is that something people were even doing?
So if you go way back, it used to be everyone thought the internet was going to be a secure place or didn't care, right? So like the way back times, you would send over a username and password, and they would literally store that password as open text in a database. Like that's way back, right?
None of us did that, I
Yeah,
promise you.
none of us did that. And so then you got a little further along where at least, the in transit was in clear text, but like the storage you would encrypt and like keep on the back end. So that takes a little bit step away from it. But what happens if someone breaks into that or leaks a key, and now all of your database, gets exposed? And we've seen issues with that still with modern tooling. But this is kind of that next phase where it's more device dependent and biometric dependent. So like unless someone's cutting off your thumb and getting in that side of it and stealing your phone, like
Let's
we're
hope
in
not.
a new phase where the web developer or the mobile developer, they don't have to worry about that as much because the products are taking care of it, and they're being like, we test our product so often it's ridiculous, and I leave that to the real engineers on our team that know how to do this, but they're getting tested constantly, and it's making sure all the new vulnerabilities that have come out, that they're tested against, and they're patched and fixed and updated regularly. So there's a larger company that does authentication. They had 2 major breaches last year, and so that became a pretty big issue in the space again. And it's a lot of it, honestly, is probably more on the social hacking side of it still. That's the biggest concern. So the people with the keys. But even at this point, when we start to go down the passkey side of it, it's going to become much more difficult, even when you break in and get access on that side, because of the way that we don't store things anymore, and the way that we're going to start authenticating. And the really cool part, as a web developer, and I just went through this with our meetup, how easy it is to like pass around jots now and like be able to have an API that only cares if my jot is good. I don't have to go ping another service or hit anything else. So it's not only becoming safer, it's becoming easier to implement too. So it's kind of that DX side of it is really cool.
Neat. Thank you for diving into that topic. I love learning about the history and sort of how we're doing things better. On the topic of developer experience, I'm wondering, from your perspective, we all want our products to be perfect and seamless, and the developer experience to be so easy that everyone can onboard, self-service and all of that. I'm wondering, from your perspective with FusionAuth, what are you guys doing really well? And where do you hit the mark when it comes to developer experience? And what can people learn from that? I love for you to share some tips for people who are listening.
Yeah, it's constant challenge, to be honest. So there's a couple different areas that I always kind of consider when we're talking about products, across the board in DevRel. So when you start to look at developer relations or developer experience, on the flip side of it, I always try to break it down, and there's articles on this too, but into 3 different categories: community, content, and product. And so those, like, you can think of community as, our Slack channel that's out there, and bringing people into that so that they can feel part of a community. And if they need answers, especially on our community edition, so that's not paid for, there's no support or anything like that, but you can run FusionAuth for free with unlimited users, which is pretty incredible. But sometimes you bump up against things and you want to know stuff. So that's how that community piece starts to come into play. And that's also like, when I did that meetup, the meetups start to become a big part of that, so that developers can get used to a product like FusionAuth and they can understand it. So that's kind of one piece of it. The next piece I think is content, and the content for me is probably my biggest focus and the area that I love working in the most. I really love doing video-based tutorials, and so like our YouTube channel, trying to grow that, making sure our newsletter is updated with different things, and so we have kind of a content team over at marketing, just making sure they're getting the right information out to the developers and making sure they have the knowledge that they need to as easily. And then the third one is product. So the product piece is always challenging, in my opinion, because the engineering team knows the most about the product, and you are constantly trying to work as a developer advocate or in developer relations of saying, okay, what's coming up in our product? What do we fix? What's the new release have in it? Let's talk about like what launch things that we need to cover. Does it need a full video breakdown? Is it cool just on release notes? So like trying to keep in touch with the product on that side is always a challenge. And also like things within the product that change. So if screens change, or if there's a new feature that messes up a ton of your documentation, like let's make sure we're talking together and we get those docs up to date. So those are all probably big pieces of it. For FusionAuth, I think one of the biggest things that we've found or that we've gotten into more recently, big push from Dan Moore, who I think Dan, right? Said,
yeah.
His big thing this year was getting our quick starts more kind of workable and like easily digestible. So we have a whole new quick start section in our docs that you can start to spin up, an example in Next.js, or you can spin up a backend by Ruby, or like a mobile native React Native in there, and like actually get a full example to understand like, oh, I see how this is working. And we can spin up the Docker image of FusionAuth, and you can jump right into a full instance. And it's been really great, and it's really helpful for me to sit down with a developer and say, hey, here's how it works if you want to see it, and we can go through the entire product, and they can ask questions, they can try out the API. I go on and on and on, but like our quick start is probably the bread and butter right now of the easiest way to get started. And I think you'll see that if you look from like a Stripe payment system all the way to, I don't know, like Supabase, when you can get into that product in the language that I think it's the best case scenario.
Yeah. What you mentioned a few things there. You mentioned Docker image. You mentioned Next.js. Like, what kind of tools, frameworks, technologies? What are you currently providing for developers? And are there plans to level that up in some ways? Are there ideas, CLIs, things that you guys don't already have that maybe you're looking to build?
Yeah, the interesting thing about FusionAuth. So let me hit the Docker image part of that first. So you can actually, if you were to go out to FusionAuth.io/download is always our kind of our big, hey, go check it out. There's many ways in there to actually run FusionAuth, the core of it. With FusionAuth, you need like a database of some kind, and typically we give you one of those with the Docker Compose file that's out there. But you can install it directly like on Mac OS. You can use it in Homebrew. There's a lot of different ways to get that up and running. But I still find like our Docker Compose file the easiest to use, because it's like anywhere you can put Docker, you can put FusionAuth, and that's like everywhere at that point, right?
Yeah.
And so what comes along with that is just the ease of there's a file that we provide in there as well. So because FusionAuth is API first, even our own like baked in admin UI. So there is a full admin backend UI that you can like add applications, add tenants. You can do your OAuth tenant settings, like you can go on and on. But essentially, if we didn't have that, you could also run the whole thing directly through APIs, which is the great part about FusionAuth. And I think as you see us start to hit more GDPR things and issues across the line like that, where you can't have shared users, you don't want shared databases, that's the cool part about FusionAuth. You're running in your own instance, whether we host it or whether you host it on your own. And so it's really easy to spin that piece up. The other piece to that, because we are just API first, we don't really have a language that you're locked into. Our SDKs and client libraries, those are kind of two different things in our world, but it gets a little confusing when we start to break them down that way. But think of an SDK more as kind of framework specific. So we have something like an Angular SDK that you can run that does very Angular based things, whereas we have kind of like a Dart client, and you're just going to use all the Dart tooling around that, not necessarily like an Angular component or a Dart component at that point. It's just the tooling that works for it. And we have, let me bring it up real quick. I'll read some of these too. Angular SDK, Dart, Go client, Java client, .NET Core, OpenAPI, PHP client, Python client, React SDK, Ruby client, TypeScript, Vue SDK. I mean, it's endless, honestly. And so a lot of times what we do is we look at, okay, who's using it the most now? What frameworks are the most popular? Let's make sure we have those covered. And then because I probably didn't cover this yet, but FusionAuth's core is closed source, and that's the only piece, but everything else that surrounds it's open source. So if someone came in and said, which we just had recently, hey, I want to make a Svelte SDK, can I add that? We're like, sure. Like, let's start working on it. Send it over to us. We'll put it in our repo. We'll get the documentation up to date. And here you go. Here's a Svelte SDK, no problem. And so it's kind of keeping in alignment that community focus, that developer experience. If you want to add something, we're more than welcome to have you add that into our ecosystem for sure.
Wow, that's great. And do you have dedicated, you mentioned at the very start of the conversation that you are doing pull requests yourself. So where does that responsibility, it sounds like there's some community contributions. Is that your team, or do you also have engineers on your team that are building and contributing things into this community? And collaborating and all of that. I'm curious what the workflow looks like for y'all.
That's a great question, and I feel like it's a question that we're constantly working on and figuring out internally too. FusionAuth is not a large company. We're like 30 some people. I'll say 35, but I don't even think that's correct. And our DevRel team is only 3 people, but we handle all of what I would consider the SDKs and the docs. So those are kind of our main areas. But that can get a little interesting, right? Because if engineering again updates the core, we need to also update docs correspondingly. And so there's some different tools in there that, and we're trying to add more in the coming year or so, where we get more standardized with things like Open API spec and tooling like that, so that we can automate more of it. We do have it somewhat automated today, where if there's an update, we reproduce the client library and things like that. So engineering owns kind of all of that core piece and the library that might update the client, but not anything that would need like a community focus. So for instance, all of our quick starts, that's all in the DevRel space. So we keep those up to date. And that's kind of always that kind of push pull, like who's actually managing this and how much work is it? And for instance, like that Svelte SDK, it's one of these discussions that we're like, okay, like what does maintenance actually look like this? Can we bring this into our fold and continue to maintain it? And so that's always the back and forth. If we had unlimited team or unlimited budget, of course we'd put every single library that's out there. And there's certain tricks that I think we can start to leverage now that we have our quick starts and things like that. And we'll start to pull those in so that it can be more automated and standardized across those products. But it's just, it is what it is. And we'll keep innovating and reinventing as we go along.
Yeah. I imagine being a smaller startup, your role has a massive impact because you are the advocate for the community and you're the one going to engineering and making sure they understand the needs of your community. And so you can confirm or deny, but I found that if you have that close relationship with a really positive impact on the product and help the community in lots of ways.
One really cool thing about FusionAuth and being smaller, and I don't know that this will ever change on size wise just because of the product itself, but FusionAuth also, their engineering team also does all of our support. So they're under that umbrella. So they're getting feedback constantly about the product issues that are common across it. And so you're kind of getting that directly into your engineering program.
Oh, wow.
Obviously, like we talk with them regularly from things we're hearing too, from meetups or like out in the Slack community. Also on our forum. Our forums probably are our biggest voice because people can go look up issues that are just regularly found and search on those things. So kind of combining all of that together is what makes it really great. I think that's one of the greatest parts when you go to a larger authentication product or any product just in general, you start to lose kind of that hand holding feel or that support feel. And I think it's really cool that we're able to keep that going with FusionAuth, even with a smaller team, but as we grow too. Um, I had one other thought. Oh, on the DevRel perspective too, I think it's really important. And from what I've seen in every developer relations team I've been on, being very close not only to product and engineering, but your marketing team too.
Yeah.
Because marketing is often, they've got a new sales thing they're pushing, it's on all these social media channels. We need to make sure we're in tune with that and understand what's happening. But also like branding, when we do slides like this slide update, I want to make sure our branding's on point with what marketing's pushing forward. We do a lot of swag giveaway as a startup, so
Nice.
making sure to work with marketing on like, hey, do we have that form in HubSpot put together yet to give away a free t-shirt? By the way, go to FusionAuth.io/download and you can get a free t-shirt. So there's always kind of that push pull between all of those different spaces. And I do think back to that whole like putting engineer in our title. At the end of the day, DevRel is fully engineering, but we have so many different aspects that we're covering constantly. You could probably put us under marketing or put us under engineering, but luckily at FusionAuth, we're kind of our own. And I really appreciate that about the company doing that for us.
Yeah. Uh, I've got a personal question, and maybe other folks might have this same question. A lot of
Sure.
the companies I've done developer relations for have been commercial products. And while we have open sourced things, tools that we've built, and we put those on GitHub and engage the community, is there anything unique or different about working for a company whose product is open source that people should know if they're going to be doing developer advocacy or developer relations for a company like that you think are great or challenging or anything above?
Yeah, so I've worked for a mixture of those type of companies. When I was at AppRight, they are what I'd consider a purely open source company. Like everything is out in the open, almost everything. There's
Yeah.
always a couple things that can't be, but for the most part, 100% out in the open. And when you look at that, and you can invite others to update like the core of your product and down to like every line of code that's in there, documentation, the whole bit. I think it's wonderful, but the challenge in that is always how do you keep outside of your VC money that came in, how do you start to make this a viable product? How do you make the company successful and continue to like start to earn a profit as well? And I think that's very challenging if you think about like larger products like a Linux, is probably one of the most massive open source products. You'll see like the Red Hats of the world that have their own version and specific support and things like that they're kind of cutting out. And I think that's always the challenge. So if I take it back to FusionAuth's world, we have kind of an interesting and unique challenge too. So our core is closed, and we allow like GitHub issues to come in against our product to say this API didn't do this right, or I was expecting this response, and that gets updated, but it gets updated by our engineers. It gets vetted, it gets tested. I think it's really important in an authentication product for that to occur. Not to say it shouldn't be out in the open, maybe it could be, but that's part of that model of let's make FusionAuth viable and successful too. So if we have the core and we open source everything around it. Now we can like have other people get involved still and feel like they're part of the development community, but we also have this core that we can sell, and we can sell at an enterprise level. So our
Yeah.
community level, it doesn't have some of the like threat detection and things like that, but in our core product that is under the hoods, we have all this proprietary IP and things like that that are in that closed source. And it's very important for a company to be able to be successful on that line too. So it's a balance at the end of the day. You have to be able to, anyone you're working with, unless you're fully bootstrapped somehow and making it work on that side of things, you have to figure out how to employ 30 people and make money, whether you're open source or not. And sometimes that's a little more difficult of a sell when you're purely open source.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious with this topic of open source and having a commercial angle to your company. Are there challenges in curating the feedback around the roadmap and the features? Do you have to manage what you say yes to and no to, because you've got a business imperative that blends with this community product that everyone can use, sort of thing?
Yeah. So a lot of times, I think the features that a community like non-enterprise will be requesting, the enterprise will actually be expecting as well. So typically those are covered. But I will say that from my experience, at least, if enterprise customers want it, they're going to get it first, right? And there's reasons for that.
Yeah.
Like they're paying very good money, not only for support, but features within your product. And the cool part about that, and typically, is that any of those enterprise features, if they make sense for it to be in the community editions, they can automatically like, hey, thank you, enterprise, for wanting this. We've put it in, we've spent the money on it. And by the way, we can give this to our community. I know that's not 100% of the case. Like if it takes, 6 months of development time and it's very specific for enterprise, like something like SAML SSO or something like that, like for us, that means it should remain an enterprise too. And so that's often the trade-off, right? If a community member wants to come in and write all of that, I would expect that that would fully remain within the community product itself, though, because that came from the community. It didn't come from our engineering time. It didn't come from, our pool of money or anything like that. And so it's hard to say, hey, we have to. But I could see instances where we're like, thank you, that was amazing. We'll do whatever we can to make it solid with you. But if we have to put that into our enterprise stuff for some reason and not in the community, like that's always the difficult part. I haven't seen that from FusionAuth side, and I haven't seen that from anywhere else where they've like taken a full community contribution and said, no, we're just taking it and putting it in enterprise. I don't feel right about that. I don't think it would be a very cool thing to see that occur either.
Yeah, that's. I'm glad you haven't encountered that dilemma, because that would be really tough. But it makes a lot of sense that you would prioritize those features that the enterprise really desire, and it makes sense to build them because that's going to help you make a sustainable business that the community long term knows that you're going to be there and that the product's going to continue to grow and improve over time.
Yeah, actually, that's a great point. I didn't even speak to the longevity portion of that. Like you want these companies to be, and I think you're starting to see that too. If anyone is listening out there for the front end developer space in the web world, you're seeing like companies take over if they weren't before. So like Vue.js is probably one of the rare ones that kind of is on its own still, but like Svelte is under Vercel, Next.js is under Vercel, Angular is under Google. They're under these larger corporations so that they can dedicate resources to it. You want a company that is successful in making money, so you know that they'll be around a long time.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's pros and cons with everything, but just know that.
Yeah. So I'd love for you to take a moment and tell the listeners about your podcast, because I love sharing. I love podcasts, so I would love to give you a chance to tell people about yours.
Yeah, thanks so much. I appreciate allowing me to do that too. So I'm wearing the FusionAuth hat, but as you can see behind me, we threw the green screen down, and I got a couple of cats back here. So CodingCat Dev Podcast came about, kind of in that same discussion. And part of it for me was getting used to talking. I found as an engineer, I was often just kind of getting my tickets, getting my GitHub issues or my Asana tasks and pounding keys. And that was, the long and short of it. I'd do a stand-up meeting, but wasn't talking enough. And so I started the podcast to kind of like get loosened up, and I was able to, make some connections using that, which I still do today. We just started our 4th season, and the cool part about CodingCat is it's a video first podcast. So often we'll have demos and examples that come out of that. And each podcast gets a dedicated page on codingcat.dev. So it's got essentially a blog about the topic that we're talking about. Some are a lot lighter. For me, it's about the people more so than the product. So we always spend at least 10 to 15 minutes, kind of like you did today, about a person's background and history and getting to know them. And then starting to like understand the product that they're working on or that they're creating. And I'll have repeat guests too that have completely switched to new products. So it's cool to watch like journeys of people come on and do that too. So the second piece to that is Code with CodingCat instead of CodingCat Podcast. And that's where we bring people on. It's during a 90-minute live coding session. So people can sponsor these coding sessions. So we just did one not that long ago with Algolia and Vue and Nuxt, I guess, where we built a quick little application and Algolia sponsored it, and it was a really cool product to see at the end of it. And we always give away the GitHub repo at the end of it, so people can like take it and run with it from there on out too. So those are the 2 big parts to CodingCat.
So if people want to get involved with your side project, how do they contact you?
Yeah, Alex at codingcat.dev is probably the easiest way. There is also, if you want to get any sort of sponsorship on a podcast, you can go to codingcat.dev/sponsorship.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again, Alex, for joining me. I really love the conversation. I think I learned a bit, and I hope our audience got a lot out of it. And I'm looking forward to all that you're doing on your one-man roadshow. But hopefully, we'll cross paths this coming year.
Yeah, I think I'll be out in the West Coast, hopefully with the Launch Darkly stuff. So might have to ping you when I get out there, Sid.
Perfect. We'll grab a coffee or a beer.
Sounds great. We'll see you next time.
Take care.